Interesting scene in Richmond on Tuesday night. The meeting organized by Richmond Mayor Malcolm Brody after he leafleted homes in the subject to the Cowichan recent Cowichan decision. What was your takeaway of that meeting?
Well, you can see why the mayor is concerned. He says, he sent these letters out and all kinds of people got a hold and said, we didn't know about this, right? They had so many people wanted to come to the meeting, they had to move it across the street from City Hall to the hotel ballroom. 700 people showed up. The legislature adjourned early that day, so 3 cabinet ministers and 3 members of the opposition could be there because the political parties are focused on the way this court decision has put the status of private property on the table, really for the first time in a big way. So, and the premier said people are right to be concerned. And he also said this week that the government is so concerned about this court decision that the government is going to go to court to try to get a stay on that decision until all the appeals are exhausted. So it's a big deal. David Eby said it's a big deal, and I think he's right.
Any indication you're seeing that the government is, I guess multiple governments, are working with the First Nation behind the scenes to try to settle all of this so it doesn't have to go to court?
Well, that's an interesting idea. I think this decision is such a sweeping victory for First Nations, particularly this First Nation, that I don't know why they would back off. There's 2 rival First Nations, and I say rival because they disagreed. They are appealing. The BC Supreme Court suspended this decision for 18 months, but 18 months won't cover the entire time it's going to take to appeal this. So I think that's why the province is pushing. And we saw an opinion poll released yesterday, the Angus Reid Group, which I think shows why the NDP government is concerned. Because that poll, people said they think the court decision undermines reconciliation, they think it could change the status of private land, and they think the provincial government is doing the right thing to oppose an appeal. So, the government isn't very often surprised by opinion polls because they do their own, and I'm guessing this poll tells you what the New Democrats have heard from their own supporters, which is, as I said, the premier put it, this is a big deal.
Interesting. You also wrote this week about the Northern Transmission Line, or at least in recent days, I can't remember this week or last week, and about the price tag being up and no real firm route, but the government is going ahead with legislation.
Yeah.
What's the status of that one?
So this is a $6 billion power line from Prince George over to Terrace, and then from there there'll be spur lines that go up to some mines in the northwest. And the government has legislation before the House, Bill 31, that will enable the project, allow First Nations partnerships, cut the independent BC Utilities Commission out of the process, and allow them to start construction by next summer. So the opposition parties have raised a bunch of questions about it. The premier came out one day this week. There'd been a vote in the House on an aspect of the bill that was a tie. And so the premier came out and he said, well, if this bill fails, we're into an election. I don't want to have to call an election. Well, if you've seen the opinion polls, you know why he does want to call an election. But he said, if this thing fails, we're going to have to go to an election. And I went, well, wait a minute. He's got a majority in the House. And the government decides when the votes get called. So if he loses a vote, it's only because they couldn't count their own members, or he told some people to stay home so he could have an excuse to call an election. But I don't think either scenario is that likely. I think what happened was the premier was putting his opponents on notice that, it's tight in the House and maybe putting a bit of pressure on the Greens. But Harold, within 2 hours of the premier saying, if this thing doesn't pass, we're going to have an election, the bill passed second reading by a vote of 48 to 42. The New Democrats have got the votes. It doesn't sound to me like a government that's got much to worry about on anything. They have a majority, even if the Greens oppose the bill.
I see. Okay, well, that's good. Well, next week, the BC Government Employees Union will be voting
Yep.
on their deal. What does that deal mean to taxpayers?
Well, they got a pretty good deal. Government's opening position was 3.5% over 2 years. The government came round under the invitation of the famous Vince Reddy last weekend and endorsed 12% over 4 years. Well, the dollar difference between those two positions is it's about 3 times as much money. The final versus the opening position. One example, government numbers, every point on a labor contract, if spread across government, and everybody in government is going to want the same deal, adds about $1.5 billion each year. So 3% would be $1.5 billion each year. The government has a balanced budget plan, such as it is, and they say their first target is to save $1.5 billion over 3 years. So the first installment of that contract wipes out all of the savings the NDP is planning. So this means the government will have less money to try to get the books under control, and it makes it even more likely that we're headed for the kind of big deficits we've known under David Eby, $10 billion a year. I doubt they'll be able to chip away at that very much. This is going to be an expensive contract to pay out.
Sorry, Vaughn, is that 3%, that 1.5 billion, excuse me, just for BCGEU?
No, that's the way it works is they go, if what we've settled with the BCGEU with them is extended right across the entire public sector, which it will be because all the other unions are going to say we want the same deal, and they usually do get the same deal. The government says 1 percentage point over 1 year across the entire public sector adds about $500 million to the government's bill for wages and benefits. So 3% would add 1.5 billion, and that's just the first installment. So in the first year, it's going to cost 1.5 billion extra, which offsets the 1.5 billion they're hoping to save over 3 years.
And if it ends up being a 4-year deal, then we're talking $6 billion.
Yes,
over
$6
the course
billion. And you know, you have to pay the wages every year. So, you know, if you think about that, well, it adds up to even more. But yeah, $6 billion is enough when you're running. Yes, they have some money in contingencies, but they need some of that money to pay for getting rid of the carbon tax and all the additional pressures on healthcare and other programs. So if you put all that into the mix and then the big wage bill, I think they're going to have trouble getting that deficit much below $10 billion, which is where it is, over the next 3 or 4 years.
BCGU's been taking up all the oxygen in the room, but I guess we're still waiting on the teachers and the nurses, 2 big groups that still have to settle.
They say the government has made very little progress on that. The government's hired all these security officers, right? But Solicitor General admitted to the legislature this spring under questions from Eleanor Sturko that these security officers aren't trained to deal with violence or machete attacks and things like that. And their instructions are, if it gets, dangerous like that, they're to retreat and call the cops. So the nurses are saying, that doesn't really solve the problem. You're going to have to put sheriffs or police officers in these really dangerous hospitals, or else you're going to have more nurses injured. And I think their patience is running out on that issue. So that will, I think, be one of the big issues in the nurses' talks. You're right, teachers. We don't know where things stand with the doctors, but there'll be some very difficult talks to come, I think.
All right. Well, we'll leave it there. Thank you, Vaughn. Have a
Thanks,
great weekend.
Harold. Next week is the First Nations Summit too. The annual meeting the government has with First Nations, sort of like the UBCM, but for First Nations. So that's next week. It's in Vancouver. So
Wow. Okay, we'll watch for
yeah,
that. Thank you.
yeah.